In this video, I'm going to build a React frontend to a FastAPI backend. So in the previous video, I built the backend. So if you want to watch that video, just click on the link in the description. But for this video, I'm going to focus only on the React frontend. So this is going to be a React app. It's using TypeScript and it's also using Tanstack Query, aka React Query. So if you're interested in learning how those work, this is the video for you. And basically what this app does is when you put in a YouTube URL and hit analyze, it will send a request to the FastAPI backend, and then it will poll for the results because this is using an LLM to categorize the different comments. And then once the result comes back, it will display the comments in their categories here. So I'll wait for that to come back. And now we see the results. So this is a chess video, so the comments are chess related. But the point is it categorizes each comment. So these are feedback comments, these are question comments, and these are thanks comments. The styling is not that great, but the idea is it's connecting to the FastAPI backend to get these results. So to get into how I built this, let's go to the code editor and start writing some code. All right, so to get started, I already have the FastAPI app running. So I have the docs open here. We can see the two endpoints, and I have Redis running in the background as well. So we don't need to look at the backend. We just need to know that it's working. If you want to know how the backend is set up, then you can watch that video. So to get started on the front end, what I want to do is I want to start by creating a Vite project. So I'll do npm create and then Vite at latest. And then I'll give it a project name of front end. And then I'll select React. And then I'll use TypeScript plus SWC. Okay, so now I'll cd into front end. I'll do npm install. And then once this is ready, I'll be able to run the demo app that they give you when you install. Okay, so everything's installed. Let me run it. npm run dev and open it. And we see the example app is here. So it's up and running. So let's open up the front end directory. And the first thing I'll talk about quickly is the CSS. So I'm not going to change any of the CSS here. So I'm going to use the defaults because writing CSS will take a bit of time. So I'm just using this as a default for this project. What I need to do though, is I need to go into app.tsx and then remove the things that I'm not going to use. So this is the code for the screen that we just saw. I want to remove everything that I don't need. So I'll just remove everything. I'll remove the state there and I'll remove the logos. Okay. So now that everything is removed, I can start from scratch. And the first thing I want to do is I just want to add a header in here. So let's create a header tag and an H1 tag, and we'll say YouTube comments analyzer. Okay. So if we go here, we see that appears. And then underneath the comments analyzer, I want to add in an input for the YouTube URL. So we'll do input, type text. Placeholder is going to be enter YouTube video URL. And then we'll just close out that tag. And then I'll just put a simple button here called analyze. So looking at it now, we see I have the input here and the analyze button to the right. Okay, so now that we have this basic stuff set up, now let's think about bringing in the library that we need. So I'm going to use Tanstack Query or the old name React Query. So that's going to be set up in main.tsx, but before I can set up anything, I need to install it. So I'll do npm I and then at Tanstack /React Query. Okay, so we're going to install React Query. And it said it added it. So now in main.tsx, we just need to modify this to use React Query properly. So what I want to do is I want to import up here. I'll import both the query client and the query client provider. And this is going to come from the library that I just installed. So Tanstack React Query. And then underneath here, so above create root, I want to create the query client, instantiate it. So we'll do query client equals new, and then the class query client. And then I can create the query client provider. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it around app. So this is the provider. So query client provider, and I can pass in the clients, query client here. So this will make sure that the query client is available in my app because it's wrapping the app component here. Okay, so that's enough for main.tsx. Let's just run it, make sure it still works. Yeah, so it looks like it still works. So now let's go over to app.tsx again. And because this app is pretty simple, I'm going to keep everything in one file here, this one component. But if you were to extend this project further, I'd recommend separating out things into multiple files. But to keep this video simple, I'm just going to put all the code in this one file. And before I get started writing any code for a React query, what I want to do is I want to install some dev tools that will make it easy to work with. So I'm going to do npm I and then at tanstack. And then this is going to be React Query DevTools. So I'll install that. And then I'll import a component from the DevTools. So import, and the component that I want is called React Query DevTools. I believe the T is lowercase. And then that's from the library that I just installed. So tanstack React Query DevTools. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put that component at the bottom. So just like this. So now when I run this and I go back to the app, we see the little tanstack icon appear in the lower right-hand corner. If I click it, it opens this up. And this will just show me information about what React Query is doing for me. So it'd be easier to deal with any problems that I might have if I run into any problems. So let's go back to the code. And the first thing I need to think about is I want to send a request when the user puts in a URL. So the idea is they'll put in a URL, hit analyze, and it's going to send a request over to the FastAPI server, this analyze endpoint. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write a function to basically send that request. So first what I want to do is I want to create a constant for the API-based URL. So the FastAPI app is running on localhost port 8000, but when I eventually go to deploy, this is going to be like somewhere else. So I just want to create a variable or a constant that will hold that. So I'll call this API base URL. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say import meta.env.vt API base URL. So I'm not going to actually use this environment variable in this video, but I'm just setting up to support using an environment variable. And what I'll do for this video is I'll do or and then localhost 8000. So this means that if it doesn't find the Vite API base URL, then it will use localhost 8000, which is necessary for this video. But when I go to deploy in the next video, I'll actually set up the environment variable for the base URL. So we have that set up. So now let's create a function to send the request over to the FastAPI app. So this is going to be an async function. It's just sending a request. So async function, and then I'll call this analyze video. And it's going to take in a URL, and that URL is going to be a string type. And it's going to return a task, right? So first, let me write the type hint for the return value. So it's going to be a task, and then put the parentheses. And then I'll create the actual type. So type task is going to be, and then we can take a look at what I'm expecting. So the task here is just going to be a task ID inside with a string. So we'll define the same thing in TypeScript. So task ID and then a string, right? So now that should work, this response type. And then I'll write the code for actually sending the request. So we'll do const response, and then I'll do await because this is an async function, and then fetch. And then what I want to do is I want to use this API base URL variable. So $, curly brackets, API base URL / analyze, because that's the name of the endpoint. So localhost 8000 / analyze. And then I want to add some options for this fetch. So the method is going to be post. That should be all caps. The headers, I want content type. I want the content type to be application JSON because I want the task or the URL to be sent as JSON because that's what the FastAPI app is expecting. And then for the body, I'll say JSON.stringify, and I want to pass in the URL. So URL. So it's going to create a JSON object that has a URL key and then URL as a value. Okay, so that's enough for the fetch. And then TanStack wants you to either perform the request or return an exception if the request doesn't work. So fetch doesn't do that by default, so I need to do it myself. So I'll say if the response is not okay, so there's an okay value on response. So if that's not true, then I'll just throw a new error. So throw new error, and I'll just say network response was not okay. So that should be enough. And then finally at the end, I want to return the JSON response. And then React Query will be able to use this response for me automatically. Okay, so now that we have this function, let's set up the app to use the URL. So first what I'll do is I'll create some state. So I'll create the URL state. So set URL is going to be the second thing here. And then I'll just have it initialize as being an empty string, right? So URL set URL is going to start off as an empty string. And then I'm going to update my input here. So on change, and then I'll create an anonymous function here. So on change, we're going to set the URL. So set URL e target value, right? So anytime the user types something into the input, it will automatically set the state to match whatever they typed in. And then another piece of state that I'll need, and really I think the only other state I need for this example project is a task ID. So after I send the request, it's going to return a task ID, and I'm going to use that task ID to poll to find out when the results are ready, because this process takes a little bit of time. So I'll just create the task ID state here. So set task ID, and then like the URL, I'll initialize the state to be an empty string, and then I'll end up using that a little bit later. So now we want to actually send this request to the FastAPI backend. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create something called a mutation in React Query. So I need to import some stuff from React Query. The first thing is going to be use mutation. And then I'll also need a query for some type hint stuff. And then since I'm here, I'll also import use query. So I'll use query and query later. But use mutation is what I'm going to use now. And this is from TanStack React Query. So now inside of the component, underneath where I declare the state, I can create this mutation. So because I only have one mutation, I'll just name it mutation, and I'll do use mutation. And then use mutation takes in a couple of things. It takes in the mutation function, so the function that will actually send the request to wherever it needs to go. So the name of this is going to be mutation fn. And then I can just pass the analyze video function to that. And then the second thing is going to be on success. So what happens on success? So first, what am I expecting as a return value? Data, and the type is going to be a task. So that's the type that analyze video is going to return, a task. And then what I want to do is I want to set the task ID to be the data.task ID, right? So here, set the task ID, and then later I can use the task ID to do more. But the whole point of this is the mutation is used for basically changing stuff on the server, and then a query is used for reading stuff on the server. But because I want to change something on the server in a sense, like I want to send a request to the server so it can run the whole AI process, I'm going to use a mutation. And then later I use a query to poll for the results. So we should be able to test this pretty quickly. So what I want to do is on the button, I want to add an on click. And what I'm going to do on click is we'll say mutation.mutate. And I'm going to pass in the URL to mutate here. So mutate is going to take the URL and then pass it along to analyze video, and then fetch is going to pass the URL over to the server. So it has to go through a few steps, but the URL is eventually going to end up on the server. And since I'm here on the button, what I'll do is I will disable the button once the mutation is pending, meaning the process has started. So disabled here is going to be mutation.isPending. Okay. Or I can say there's no URL. So I can say not URL.trim. So, trim is just to remove any white spaces. So if there's no text inside of the URL, then the analyze button will also be disabled. And then on the analyze button, there are a bunch of ways to handle this, but to keep it simple, what I'll do is I'll say if the task ID exists, then the text will be analyzing with an ellipsis there. And then if it's not set, then it will just be analyze. So that's a string because I put it in the curly brackets. So now it should still be analyzed, but we see the button is disabled. And as soon as I type in something, the button becomes enabled. Okay, so I think I have enough to test this. So what I'll do is I will paste this in. I'll open up the DevTools. I'll go to the mutations tab because I'm sending a mutation. And I'll hit analyze and we'll see if it works. So it gave me this output. And then looking at it, I got a task ID. So it looks like the mutation worked. It was able to call the function that I defined, send the request to the server. And if I go over here and if I look, we see the post is 200. So everything was fine with the mutation, sending the URL over to the server. So now that I have that, now I have to think like, okay, how does this work in terms of getting the results? So with React Query, this is pretty easy. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create another function first to get the status. So I'll just do it underneath this analyze video. So this will also be an async function, and we'll call this get status. And the input is going to be a task ID, which is a string. And then the result is going to be task status, which I need to define. So let's go up here to type. And let's define the task status. So if we go over to the FastAPI app again, and we look at our schemas, we have task status. So we basically have a task ID, status, which are both strings, and then we have data, which just can be anything. So here in task status, my task ID will be a string. My status will also be a string. And then data is going to be something that has an object, right? So the object, the key will be a string. And then the value, I could just put it as anything, but instead what I'll do is a list of comments, right? And I'll define comment right now. So above task status, I'll create a type called comment. And then I know this from the FastAPI app, I'm expecting a string, a category, and text, which is also a string, okay? So the task status type should be okay now. So now let's go back to get status. So here it's going to be very similar to the analyze video in the sense that I'm going to call fetch. So await fetch. And then I'm going to pass in the base URL. So I'll just copy that. It's the same idea. And then the endpoint that I'm calling is status. So status. And then there's also the task ID, right? So task ID, it should be the same style as the parameter there. So it's going to fetch status with the task ID. And then let me close that out. And then I don't need to add any extra options here because this is a simple GET request. So I'll do the same thing here where I say if the response is not okay, throw an error. And then I'll return the JSON response. So return response.json. So pretty similar to analyze video. The only difference is this doesn't have a post request, so I don't have to like JSONify the body or anything like that. So now let's set up the query. So underneath the mutation, I'll do another one, and use query, which I'm using here, can return a bunch of stuff, but I'm only interested in the data, right? For this simple example. In a real example, there are some other things like is pending, is failed, stuff like that. But in my case, I think data is enough. And this use query is going to be returning a task status. So I'll just put that there so I don't get any complaints from the linter. And then there are a few options I want to add on use query. So the first is going to be the query key. And the query key's purpose is to let TanStack or React Query know when the data is different between queries, right? So it will keep track of the results of a query and cache them for me if it sees that the query key for 2 queries are the same. It won't like use up extra requests. But if it sees that the query keys are different, then it will perform the request when necessary. So the query key is a list, and I'm starting the list with status, and then the second thing in the list will be task ID. So because status is fixed and I only have one query, what really matters here is the task ID. So if it's querying with the same task ID, then it will just cache it. But if the task ID changes, then it will start to query again. In this example, it's going to be a little different because I'm doing polling, but that's the overall idea. Next, we have the query function. And the query function, I'll just define it here. And it simply gets status and then task ID. Right, so I'm creating an anonymous function here because I need to pass in the task ID. And then what makes this one a little bit different is this won't always be enabled. So what I want to do is when the task ID exists, then this will be enabled. And because the task ID can be an empty string, I just need to do this twice. So this turns into a Boolean, right? So if this is true, then not that will be false, and then not that will be true. So just a little trick there to get around the fact that this starts off as an empty string, which will be false to initialize. So enabled there. And then because this is a poll, what we want to do is we want to set up a refetch interval. So refetch interval, and then that's going to take in a query. So the query being the results from sending the query. And then inside of here, what I want to do is I want to create a variable called status or a constant called status, and that's going to be query.state.data. So this is the result of the query, and it's going to be task status. So we have the status string, and we may not always have that. So I'll do dot question mark or question mark dot and then status here just in case it doesn't exist. So if it exists, it will have the status. So I want to return a number if the refetch interval should continue, or I want to return false if it shouldn't. So refetch interval is expecting either a Boolean or a number when you return. If you return a number, that means it will refetch the interval after that many milliseconds. And if you return false, then it will stop the whole refetching process. So what I'll do here is I'll say if status is equal to completed, which is the case when the whole process is done, then I'll return false, meaning the refetch to stop. Otherwise, return 2000 because I want to poll every 2 seconds. Okay, so that should be enough. So let's go back to the app, and we're on queries here. So let me put in the URL and hit analyze, and we'll see if it's just updating here. So if I look down here in this corner, we see that the query is being called every 2 seconds, and then I'll just wait until the status comes back as completed, and then I'll see that it stops. So here we see processing for the status. It's still updating every 2 seconds. So I'm just going to wait for this to complete. And let me just make sure there are no errors in the FastAPI app. It doesn't look like it, so it's still polling. So let's go back here. Okay, so now we see the status is completed. And if we look at the time, we see it is not updating the time any longer, meaning that it's no longer querying. So we're able to get it to query for the data. So basically the last thing we have to do is we need to display the results. So here in the return, what we want to do is under the button, that's where I want the results to go, but above the dev tools, what I'll do is I'll say if data, and I'll use the question mark thing again, just in case status isn't there. If this is completed, and this should be a string. So let me make that a string. So if this is complete, then what I want to do is I want to return some JSX, or just add some JSX in here. So we're going to have a div, and then inside of that, we're going to have a section called analysis results. And then underneath analysis results, I'll have another div. And inside of here, I want to do a map over the keys. So if you watch the previous video, the format of the output is basically the name of the category and then a list of comments that match that category. So because the categories aren't fixed, I have to iterate over the keys and then do something for each key. So for this, I'll do object.keys and then data.data. So data.data has a bunch of keys for the object. And then I'll do .map, and then I'll pass in the key. So inside of here, I want to create a div that has the key as the key. So Let's close out the div there. And inside of the div, I want to create an H3 so it looks a little bit better. And then it's going to be key again. So remember, the key is like a category. So that's what we're going to see. And then another div here. I don't know why it's not auto-completing the divs, but another div here. And then I want the actual data. So data.data, and then we're going to pass in the key. We're going to do map, which is mapping over the list of comments. And then I'll name each comment item. And then what I want to have here is div key equals item.id, because each comment has an ID. Close out that div. And then I want to have like a paragraph with the actual item.text here. So I think this is enough. Let's make sure there are no errors here. If I go back, okay, so we see everything looks good. We see the analysis results. We see thanks, we see feedback. So these are the categories, questions, and then these are the actual comments. So as you can see, it didn't take much code to get the front end to work. The main thing that we used here to make things simple was React Query, which makes it really easy to send requests. We don't have to use like any use effects stuff. So if you're not using React Query in your React projects, you definitely should. But everything beyond that is just like standard React stuff, just to get everything to show. We have to map over a few things, but overall, pretty straightforward. So that's all I wanted to cover in this video. In the next video, I'm going to cover how to deploy these two things together. So if you want to watch that video, just click on the video here once it's ready, and I'll see you in that video.